Welcome, everyone. We have a special guest today, and his name is e- his name is Ethan. And today we are going to talk about podcasting. So nice to see you. Sorry, nice to see you, Ethan. We met during a networking meeting, and I should say that Ethan has shared some really meaningful tips, and Ethan has a lot of expertise in podcast. Welcome, Ethan.
Thanks for so much for having me on the show.
So, Ethan, podcasting, as we all know, is like very much in trend, especially more after the pandemic. But I would say the last 10 years have been the boom. Like 10 years back, I did not know what even a podcast meant. I saw it was just an app on my phone, but I never knew what the microphone icon stands for and what exactly is. Fast forward to, I would say 2019, 2018, 2019 is when I actually realized podcasting is huge, and most best selling authors, most people, like most famous personalities, have already shot, if not one, numerous episodes. So what came to my mind is, what's how is the experience very different of reading a book versus listening to a podcast, according to you? And why do you think that podcasting might overtake reading in the future, or is that a possibility?
Okay, cool. So podcasting, look, I think they're definitely two separate mediums. And the audiobook also kind of throws a spanner in the works slightly because a lot of what I'm going to say now about podcasting also applies to audiobooks. But be that as it may, a podcast, what the thing that makes a podcast incredible is that it's one of the very few mediums where you can and consume the entire piece of content while doing something else. We're so used to heavily visual content nowadays. Video is pretty much the name of the game for a lot of people, but podcasting is an audio first medium. Yes, we're recording the video of this right now. This content can and should be able to be consumed without ever having to see any of the visuals. So, for example, I commute about half an hour to and from work every single day. I drive half an hour on the highway. So every single time I'm driving to work, I'm listening to a podcast. Um, it similarly when people clean their houses, when people go to the gym, it's one of the few mediums where you can truly be quite invested in the content without having to look at anything. Um, so that in terms of the experience of a podcast, that's truly the thing that sets it apart. It's obviously quite similar to listening to music. And then audiobooks have also now, are part of this niche. I know a lot of people who use audiobooks in a similar way. However, the typically you also don't have to be quite as engaged in a podcast to follow along. It's very often that people might drift in and out slightly, their attention span might waver. And because a podcast is a bit more of a casual medium, you don't have to lose anything. People don't feel like they have to backtrack. Whereas if you're listening to a storybook, a novel, or like a how-to book, you might have to be a lot more engaged in the content. So in terms of experiencing the content, that's what sets them apart. But if I want to talk about the strengths of podcasting and why the medium has exploded, for the creator, it's a medium that has a lot lower investment and requires kind of if you compare it to video, for example, you would need a good camera, you will need a good video setup, you'll also need video production skills. Um, Whereas a podcast, truly you only really need microphones and maybe an internet connection to record it in order to actually capture the content. Um, so because of that, podcasts also have the ability to be a lot more casual, a lot more off the cuff. This podcast is not scripted at all. We're just chatting. Whereas a book obviously requires a huge amount of effort to go into it to generate a book. To write a book at like if you're writing it quickly will take you a few months. If you're writing it very, very quickly, you'll finish that book in a few months. And then if you're turning it into an audiobook, you still need to go through the entire process of producing and recording, editing, cleaning up, packaging, submitting that entire audiobook, which takes a lot of money and a lot of time. Whereas a podcast, if you have the skills or if you have team members or are employing a service for the skills, you could record a podcast today and have it be going out on the platforms within a day or two, because typically the production is a lot lighter. Look, they are very heavily edited and very heavily scripted podcasts. It's just a medium. It's not necessarily saying anything about the actual content, but podcasts have the potential to be a lot quicker to produce, which means people can get the content out a lot faster. Will podcasts ever overtake books? I doubt it. I think they kind of go hand in hand. But I guess podcasting is a media that has been growing over time, where books have kind of not, aren't at their peak, aren't at the heights that they used to be. So in that way, you could say that podcasts are overtaking books, but you know.
W- When when do you think books peaked,
So
approx?
if you look at yeah, so look, it's hard to give an exact year, but if you look at the trends, everybody has spoken about how the publishing industry has been, um, you know, in decline over time. I think obviously newspapers and magazines have felt the biggest hit on this. So if you're talking just about reading content, and especially fast content, I'd say that podcasting is slowly but surely overtaking those markets. I'd say books as physical media were most likely at their peak before large scale uptake of the internet. Now that everybody has access to the internet, a lot more people are just reading things online instead of in the physical book media. But I will say this is not a dig to the book industry. I love reading. I think that the book industry, for lack of a better term, has been able to pivot and get onto newer platforms. Ebooks are a massive thing. Audiobooks are a massive thing. So perhaps the day of the physical book might not be at its height anymore, but I think that reading is obviously still here to stay.
Yeah, I agree with you. Although there is a new trend now that is a lot of people are choosing to go back to the physical books, and this comes from an effort of reducing screen time, because a lot of people now are being conscious that they're spending so many hours over the screen. So, there is a reverse trend, but we'll have to wait and watch how this reverse trend goes on. Um, Ethan, tell me, according to you, from your experience, what are the traits of a good podcaster? I want to
Okay.
learn from you.
All right. So this might not be, look, I think when you hear this question, people immediately think about things like having a good voice, you know, the things that make a podcast sound good. And those things obviously are important, but not really the most important thing. The reality is that most people don't get their podcast past episode 5 or 6. Like if you Google pod fade, you can read some articles about it. the majority of podcasts haven't been updated recently. Most people struggle to release regular podcasts. So I'd say the biggest differentiator between a good podcaster and a quote unquote bad podcaster would be someone who has follow through and can really commit. Because as I said earlier, a podcast isn't particularly difficult to produce in comparison to other forms of media. A lot less has to go into it to produce the bare minimum of what's considered a podcast. But in order to get your podcast to a large audience, in order to grow your podcast, you need to be going at it for a long time. You really have to be going at it for a super long time. Most podcasts that didn't have the support of a large production company or don't have celebrities attached to it take a year, 2 years to really start gaining any kind of traction. So it's that consistency of every single week recording, editing, producing that episode, sending it out. So that's the one, is that consistency. The second most important thing, or I would say it's even tied with the first one, but if you don't have consistency, nothing else will matter, is a real ear for quality. And this comes in many forms. So it's not good enough to have a podcast with low audio quality because people will just stop listening. Especially in a world now where it's very simple and very cheap to get reasonably good gear. You have to have your podcast. You have to constantly be thinking about, how can I improve the quality of this podcast? Is my microphone better? Good enough? If not, get a better one. Is the space that I'm recording in the best possible space that I have available to me? If not, find a better one. And I'm not saying spend thousands on a studio. What I am saying is having the presence of mind to think, hey, maybe if I record in the lounge because there's more carpets there, my podcast could sound better. Maybe I should try in the cupboard. So it's that constant pursuit of improving the content. So there's the technical quality, which also includes things like editing your podcast. A completely unedited podcast is just lower quality than one that has been edited, because it just means that someone has spent some time to tighten it up, and also ultimately respecting the time of the audience. If your podcast is an hour-long recording, but there's 40 minutes of good content in your podcast, make it 40 minutes rather. There's no need to have longer content just to have longer content, and it's lazy to leave it as is. So that's the other thing. And there's other stuff as well. So like post-production on your podcast, including things like reducing some background noise, equalizing, compressing, some mastering of your audio to make it so that the intro of your podcast isn't super loud and the outro of your podcast is super soft. There's that quality control checks that really, really makes for a good podcast. So those are the two. One is about commitment, one is about technical and quality, and then the third one is about content. So I also work in radio, and I'm really privileged to work with some really high level radio producers. And those two things they really always have down. The third thing that they like really sets them apart is finding the unique and interesting content ideas and the humanity in it. So it sounds a little vague, but what I'm saying is there's very many podcasts that do the exact same thing, cover the exact same topics. Today, we're going to be talking about top 5 tips for entrepreneurs with their business plan, right? You've all heard many different podcasts that have something similar to that. What's your podcast? What makes yours different? What makes you different as a person? And how can you bring that part of you into your content? How can you make your content more human, more relatable, more real, and less overly corporate, less overly generic? So if you can get those 3 things right, release consistently, even if it's not as good as you wanted yet, get it out. Constantly be seeing, how can I improve the quality of this in all aspects, and finding and finding that thing about your podcast and about you that makes it different and special. That makes a good podcaster.
And okay, so uh, those were some really great tips. By the way, how is my sound quality, Ethan? Is it good, or do you
It's
think there's room
it's
for improvement?
it's yeah. So I'd say out of 10, it's like a 6 or 7. It's okay. It's fine. But if you were to listen to the really high quality audio, you could see there's a lot of room for improvement. Yours is definitely usable. I wouldn't say it's bad quality by any means, but unfortunately, the 9 and 10 quality that requires microphones that cost thousands of dollars. But there's that 7 to 8 range where it's just a slightly better microphone, slightly better space to record, slightly better post processing, and then all of a sudden it sounds great. We live in a really, really great time for at home recording.
Hmm.
You don't need to invest thousands and thousands. You can just go on whatever music site, find the right microphone for your space, and it can cost you way, way less than it would have in the past. So, yeah.
Which is why, to all of you who are watching this session, I need your support so that I can start buying a microphone. So, please write down in the comments if you think my voice quality needs to improve, and we'll work together and we'll get the best microphone. Anyway, uh, Ethan, what about, let's talk about audience engagement and what mistakes do you see in a day to day that podcasters make, and how would you avoid them?
Cool. So, I'd say the first super obvious mistake is just not giving your audience a call to action. Like, that's what the intro and the outro of a podcast is for. And sometimes people create this content without any realization that somebody is going to be listening to this, and you could ask them to do something to contribute to the next episode or contribute to your community. Ultimately, any single every single piece of content engagement and audience building is really just about building up a community for yourself and your brand and whatever it is that you're trying to do. So I'd say, to flip it slightly, I'd say some of the really good examples I've seen of good audience engagement are when people create a space for the audience to be outside of the podcast. So, for example, Facebook group, Discord community. Discord seems to be quite popular, especially with younger people nowadays, as a way to house their content. And eventually, you could look at the paid options as well, like Patreon or similar. But I'd say the first mistake is not actually doing something with the audience. Even if one person's listening, tell them, hey, subscribe to the newsletter, and give them a good reason why to do that, not just because you must do it, but like, why should they do this? Oh, if you subscribe to the newsletter, you can read my, opinions on X, Y, and Z. Or click on the link in the podcast episode to join the Discord group, and now you have them there. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, it's going to sound slightly contradictory, but I've also seen people kind of putting the cart before the horse. So where they haven't recorded an episode yet at all, but they're already thinking about, how am I going to monetize my community? It's like, first, make your content good and realize you'll be super lucky if 10 people listen to it. It's like an amazing thing if 10 people actually hear it for the first episode. First, get your content in. Give your audience at the early stages maybe just an easy way for them to join your tribe. So join the WhatsApp group, join the Discord group, whatever it is. So you can have them, keep them there. Then over time, ideally, you can then start talking to your community about what is it that they actually want. So instead of assuming I assume my community is going to want 6 extra episodes from me, and they're going to pay $50 a month when nobody actually wants that. Maybe what they want is a weekly Q&A session with you, or whatever it is. So I guess the mistake is not fostering a community, and then also not taking into that account the actual wants and needs of the community, and just assuming because you want to get money out of the podcast, when in reality, it's not going to make money for a long time.
So basically, to summarize, uh, it's if you enjoy doing it, if you enjoy making podcast, if you enjoy actually, if you enjoy talking to people in the first place, then podcast could be something for you, right? And then if you believe in creating very good content which gives value to the guest as well as to the listeners, then it's like a win situation.
Exactly,
So
exactly.
not
It's
just win-win, but like win-win-win.
100%. And that also ties into the fact that your podcast recording can be successful, even if only a very small amount of people listen to it. Because if you get a guest on and engage and provide value to the guest and they provide value to you, that already might be something that's useful to you in your business or your growth. And then providing value to the audience, as you said, is definitely that third win.
Where do you see podcasts in around 2030, which is now 7 years from now? And one question that came to me in the in the earlier part is, how do you manage to focus while you're maybe driving to work, since you have to concentrate on the roads and on the signs? So how do you manage to focus on concentrating on the driving part and also listening and processing information from the podcast?
So yeah, I'll answer that first question. So the one hand is once you've driven a route enough times, there's an amount of autopilot that you go on. So there's that. But it's got to do also to do with the fact that a podcast doesn't always have to be super active listening. Like you're going to be listening to it, but there's definitely times when your brain takes control because maybe someone's driving terribly and you need to be very careful now. And you know, you 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 don't always have to be listening 1000% attention to that podcast. Sometimes the attention of the podcast wavers when something else more important comes up. But I do find that the brain is very, I mean, look, we've been listening to radio in cars for since before I was born, right? Um, and when the hosts speak or when the news comes on, you still listen to that. But if you need to take control of the car, or if you need, if something serious is about to happen, you can stop paying attention to that and switch over. So there's definitely a way to do it. In terms of podcasting over the next 7 years, it's actually a really tricky question to answer based on the country, I've realized, weirdly enough. So I'd say America, Canada, and then the UK, but specifically America and Canada are like super far ahead of everybody else in terms of their podcast industry. They've got podcasts that are household names. They've got podcasts that have tens of thousands of Patreon subscriptions, meaning they make a huge amount of money from them because they've become complete brands. Look, I'm not a fan of the guy, but Joe Rogan managed to turn his entire career into becoming a podcaster. There's many other examples. So in America, I'd say podcasting has already exploded. It's already one of the main forms of media. I'd say so I'm in South Africa. In South Africa, we're still super far behind. It feels like only recently in the last 2 or 3 years have we even started getting any podcasts that have got any amount of real traction. There's some older ones that have been around for a while, but there's not there's only recently that we've been seeing podcasts in the hundreds of thousands of views. But I will say that the radio industry especially is taking it quite seriously, and there's definitely people who are getting in there now. So I'd say that over time, podcasting is only going to continue to grow as it becomes more and more normalized. One thing that's happened in the last few years is that a bunch of celebrities have all of a sudden got a podcast, whereas in the past, in the very beginning, podcasters were kind of their own unique bunch, separate from the mainstream celebrities. Now, the most popular podcasts in the world are like Conan O'Brien, people like that, which is like, it's good for the podcast industry, but it's difficult for the smaller creators because it feels like, well, if you just need to be famous and jump in, then you can just have a giant audience. But I think ultimately it's good because it means more people are aware of what a podcast is and more people are getting it on podcasts. I'd say that video podcasting also seems to be on the rise. In my mind, podcasting is an audio medium. We could have turned these cameras off and it would have still be counted as a podcast, in my opinion. And I think that's still ultimately how most podcast listeners consume their content, is just the audio version on their phone. However, I have been seeing a massive trend towards video podcasting because there's many benefits of that. One of them is obviously that you can create social media content way more easily out of a video podcast if you have visuals out of it than if you have an audio podcast that you have to create visuals for. So I think video podcasting is on the rise. Therefore, YouTube is becoming more of a relevant podcast platform than it used to be. There was a time in our history when iTunes, now Apple Podcasts, but then iTunes was the only place that you could get a podcast. Now we can get it in numerous places, including video versions. So I think that's definitely a massive trend. I think more and more businesses will start seeing the value of podcasting for themselves and start using it. And then what I'm hoping for is that there'll be more and more innovative podcasts coming out. There definitely are people doing insanely cool podcasts that are like miles ahead of everybody else. If you
Any
Google
rec any recommendations apart from Joe Rogan?
yeah, so firstly, I wouldn't recommend Joe Rogan. But he's a good example, but I'm not a fan. But I would say that if you look at the company Gimlet, so Gimlet, Gimlet, they have some truly, truly incredible podcasts. One of my favorite ones is called Reply All, which I think may not be around anymore, but regardless, it does really interesting stories about the internet. They have a they have a really, really cool episode where they kept getting called by scammers and then flew out to India and confronted them in person. It is the most crazy podcast. Like these American people going back and forth with this tiny group of scammers, and they've done all kinds of other really interesting ones as well. They did one where they just walked outside through the streets and just recorded themselves as they went along, and they broke into a abandoned house, and so it's like they're taking the podcast format outside of just interviews. Look, I love interview podcasts, I love discussion podcasts, but ultimately podcasting is just a medium, and it's especially an audio medium, which means if you are a really creative person, you can play with that. So literally any of Gimlet's podcasts, I'd highly recommend. And then these are super famous ones, but if you haven't heard them before, Serial, which is like a crime podcast that was like it's true journalism. Like you could tell years went into the production of this podcast. So I definitely would recommend those.
Okay, thank you, Ethan. That was a wonderful conversation, and I have a message for my audience is all of you who are watching. You can seek a lot of valuable tips from this episode if you have stayed back. And yes, podcasting is the future. I know I should have made my introduction more informative, but next time I will make sure. So that is a feedback for me. And Ethan, I hope you enjoyed the session. And you are like an encyclopedia of podcasts, and can't wait to see you, in the top 5 in the next few years, and you're working hard, and you're working really hard as well. I saw your LinkedIn post just about 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes before starting the session. So, if anyone is interested in discussing more about podcasts, you can get in touch with Ethan. I will link your his LinkedIn in the description. And thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time.